This is the seventh in a series of short presentations that deals with myths that are prevalent in risk management. The purpose of managing risk is to improve decision making so that we make it more likely that our subsequent actions contribute as much as possible to the achievement of our goals and objectives. There is no other purpose. However, unfortunately, some in the risk management profession seem determined to make what are quite simple and useful concepts and processes much more complex and opaque. The series of presentations demonstrate how confused and confusing is the way many in our profession explain how we should manage risk. Myth 7 concerns the vital step of establishing the context. This step, the first of the linear steps in the risk management process, precedes risk identification, analysis and evaluation. And some risk management professionals and indeed organisations think that it only has to be done once per organisation, maybe only once per year, or at least written up in some form of risk management plan. However, as we will shortly see, it is vital that the context is established for each application of the risk management process. In other words, every time we exercise the risk management process in support of decisions. And particularly we find in projects that it's only done once for some form of project risk assessment, and not every time we deploy the risk management process in support of a new decision. The establishing the context step is the essential precursor to risk identification, analysis and evaluation. It involves preparing for and planning the subsequent steps in the process. We start by defining the pertinent objectives for the organisation in relation to the decision being made. We also are concerned with identifying the stakeholders for that decision. In other words, the people who need to be involved, whose views need to be taken into account, who may have information we need to draw upon, or, quite frankly, whose objectives may just make life difficult for us. We need to list them, understand what are their points of view, their objectives, and their communication needs, so that we can appreciate how we're going to communicate with them, how we're going to involve them in the decision-making process, in the application of the risk management process going forward. While most organisations have a standard set of risk criteria that are based on their objectives, these do need to be customised for a particular application of the risk management process and in support of a particular decision. For example, general wording can be made more specific so it becomes more useful and pertinent. Measures can be converted into factors which are appropriate for that risk assessment, for that application in support of a decision. The third part of establishing the context is about understanding the scope and purpose of the decision. And we find many organisations encourage their staff to walk into a risk assessment without having previously defined that. Why are we here? What are we trying to achieve? And therefore a considerable amount of time at the beginning of the workshop is wasted by people arguing about what is and is not inside scope and what we're trying to achieve today. The fourth element of establishing the context is vital. This is where we seek to understand what are the major risk sources in the external environment and the internal environment that are pertinent for this particular decision. If we don't do this now, we then are ill prepared for the risk assessment. We can't then identify risks which are just scenarios, examples of things that might happen that might lead to consequences that have effects on objectives. We can't come up with those examples unless we understand what are the pertinent risk sources associated with this decision. We also use the information from steps 3 and 4 of establishing the context to develop a structure for the risk identification and analysis exercise. We generally group these things together under a series of thematic headings so that in the time that's available for risk identification analysis, we are as comprehensive as possible. We leave as little out, and the rigor of the discussion is appropriate given the scope of the decision and the time that's available to conduct the risk assessment. Unless we do this, we find that the risk identification analysis discussions are lopsided. We spend too much time on a few and ignore what could be quite significant risks associated with the decision. We run out of time. As you can see from this, if we fail to prepare for a particular risk assessment, not only do we waste people's time, but we can end up with very unreliable output. So if we don't do this, we cannot identify the major risk sources, the major source of uncertainty beforehand, so that people can't start thinking about them. We can't appreciate who are the key stakeholders for the decision and how their views need to be taken into account and how they need to be involved in this process. We can't help people prepare. We can't help them understand what their role will be in the workshop and the thoughts they have to have beforehand. It makes it very difficult to actually scope and define the objectives of the workshop, and we can waste a lot of time arguing about those if we don't prepare them beforehand. If we don't have a structure which arises from establishing the context, we're probably going to end up with a lopsided and incompetent risk assessment that's not comprehensive enough. In other words, we miss some risks out, or we discuss some risks in much more detail than others. And then finally, whoever is facilitating the discussion can't prepare by choosing the appropriate tool, given the decision that's being made, given the people involved, given the subject area. So in summary, if we don't establish the context every time we undertake a risk assessment, we just end up wasting everyone's time, and we probably end up with output which is pretty useless. Thank you.